Computer. Okay, friends, so welcome to our weekly webinar. This webinar is conducted for the weekly fasting group. We fast as a team for 24 hours every week. And if you are interested to join this group, in the description, there will be my details, my contact details. You can write me a WhatsApp message and I will very happily add you there. Now, today we have Ivana. She's going to enlighten us a very interesting subject of food addictions and addictions in general and everything related to that. So Ivana, please do.
Hi guys, so I'm back again. Thank you for having me. So we're going to talk about food addictions today. And it's funny, but because when we think of food addiction, we often picture really obese people, like those that you might see on TV shows, like My 600-Pound Life, who weigh upwards of 600 pounds and consume insane amounts of food, practically eating themselves to death. But very few average, what we consider normal people, ever imagine that they could be food addicts. And it's not until we have switched to the raw diet and left behind our SAD diet that we become aware of the pathological relationship that we may have had with food. The problem is that this food attitude has been so deeply ingrained in us and so normalized that we rarely question it. In fact, some people wear their addiction as a badge of honor, proudly calling themselves foodies and gourmands. They take tremendous pride in the fact that food is basically their hobby. And they derive a great sense of gratification and even superiority, thinking that they are more sophisticated than the rest of us lowly plebs, whose palate is much less refined. This fixation on food is so perverse and so pervasive that we have entire television channels with round-the-clock programming that is solely dedicated to fetishizing food. I mean, just think about it. You have people trying to come up with numerous new and inventive ways of manipulating and combining ingredients to make food even more decadent and pleasurable, and therefore more addictive. This pathological attachment to food is one of the many reasons why so many people often don't succeed on fruitarian or even just plain vegan lifestyle. It's time for us to face the fact that a great majority of people are food addicts. And if you're not sure that you're addicted to food, just think of something that you really, really enjoy eating. And then ask yourself, how would you feel knowing that you can never, ever have this food again? If that thought fills you with anxiety or longing or fear of missing out, if you simply can't imagine never, ever having that food again, then you should know that you have an addiction. I have a friend who has Crohn's, which is a disease where there's so much lymphatic stagnation in the intestinal wall that it swells up and thickens, shrinking the intestinal opening and making it very difficult to move digestive waste out of the body. And as this disease progresses, then sections of the intestines become so blocked that they have to be cut out. And eventually you remove so much of the intestine that you can no longer eliminate your digestive waste in a normal way. So what they do is that they attach a bag to the small intestine and they sew your anus shut And then the person basically poops in a bag, which hangs outside of their body. So I told this woman that I could help her. I could help her get her health back, but it would take changing her diet drastically. You know what she said to me? Oh no, that is one thing I cannot do. And I laughed because it's so preposterous. Pooping in a bag for the rest of her life, she could do. But going on a juice fast was a complete non-starter for her. And so this just shows how much discomfort and pain people are willing to put up with for a fleeting pleasure that they get from eating certain foods. You see, the problem is that we don't eat to fuel our bodies. We eat primarily to bond, to mood alter, to stimulate or suppress. Most of our food choices are driven by our feelings. Emotional eating has already been discussed in this group by Anna, who is a licensed psychotherapist. And of course, I agree that it's extremely important for us to work on our traumas and deal with suppressed emotions. And both Anna and I also talked in prior webinars about the role of parasites in appetite and cravings, and how killing them can help change our taste preferences and help us with reducing or eliminating cravings for bad foods. But what if you already did all that, and yet you still cannot get a grip on your eating? So many people come to me talking about not being able to stop binging. And it's not even that they're binging on really bad foods like animal products. You know, they're still eating plant-based. They're eating fruits and vegetables and cooked foods. But there is a pathological component to their eating because of the compulsive nature of their appetite and the inability to regulate it. They simply cannot stop themselves because they're overwhelmed by this insatiable appetite. I know someone who dry fasts regularly, and she can go without eating and drinking for 3 to 4 days. But as soon as she has a bite of food, it's like a monster is awakened inside her, and she goes off the deep end. She simply cannot stop eating, almost to the point of sickness. So you see, it's not that she's craving meat or bread or ice cream, which would be indicative of parasitic infestation and influence. Her problem is that she can't seem to feel full no matter how much she eats. I see this being a huge problem for so many people in the detox community. In Facebook groups, people ask all the time, how do I get my eating under control? And the answer that they get invariably is, you have to work on your emotions. Doesn't it just make you mad? That is probably the most frustrating and unhelpful piece of advice you can get when you're struggling with binge eating or food addiction, because it's so vague and so nebulous, and it gives you absolutely zero useful, actionable information that you can follow to help you break out of this destructive pattern. I mean, what does working on your emotions even means? If we're talking about therapy, then, pardon my French, you're screwed, because therapy can take a very long time. But I would also challenge the notion that therapy on its own is the answer. It is most definitely not the full answer. To understand what it means to work on our emotions, we must also understand what creates emotional fluctuations and how they manifest. For example, when we feel sad, fearful, or anxious, what does that really mean in physiological terms? You see, our emotions are not just a result of our thoughts and beliefs, but they're also manifestations of the various aspects of our hormonal and neurotransmitter activity. So today, I'm going to give you the keys to the kingdom. I'm going to give you practical, usable information that you can work with by taking a look at the underlying chemistry that drives addictive or compulsive behavior. And you will see how much of our emotions is caused and regulated by neurotransmitters. All right, so first, let's define addiction. Addiction is a compulsive behavior that is manifested by substance abuse or some type of activity in order to mood alter. Compulsion is an especially important component here because compulsion is described as an irresistible urge that is very difficult to control. If you're in therapy, then your therapist has probably given you tools for behavior modification, like breath work, meditation, journaling, tapping, and so on. But you see, the problem is that in order to employ any of these techniques, you have to possess a certain degree of self-awareness, rationality, and control. Unfortunately, when we are in the midst of a crisis, these qualities are in a very, very short supply. What happens most of the time is that we don't even remember these coping mechanisms while we are riding that emotional roller coaster. Somehow, we seem to lose the capacity to think clearly, activating the factory installed survival program in our primitive reptilian brain. And when this happens, we start operating on autopilot. And whatever program has been adopted by the psyche as a defense mechanism automatically gets switched on, putting us entirely under its control, where we don't seem to be able to control it. I was really able to see this mechanism in action when I went water skiing for the very first time. Beforehand in training, they tell you that if you fall and are about to be dragged under, you should let go of the rope and close your mouth. Simple enough, right? Well, maybe not. Because every time that I knew I was going to be pulled under the water, the first thing I would do is open my mouth and take a deep breath. Why? Because it's the survival instinct deeply embedded into our psyche. You see, when we know that we're about to be deprived of air, our instinct is to inhale in order to fill our body with oxygen, because breathing equals living. It's a reflex that is turned on automatically. Obviously, it was the completely wrong thing to do in that particular situation, because what happens when you inhale while being submerged is that you swallow a ton of dirty lake water, which of course in no way helps you breathe better. And so every time I would make a new attempt, I would tell myself that if I fall again, I'm going to close my mouth. Okay? Just close your mouth. But despite all that self-talk, when the moment came, I would inevitably do the exact opposite of what I was supposed to do. Why? I mean, am I just that stupid? You see, what happens when traumatic feelings come up is that our established coping patterns go into effect, and they're activated by our survival instinct. And when this happens, the conscious mind takes a back seat, and then something else takes over. And this is when our rational self gets hijacked by the primitive reptilian brain, and we're no longer in control to make conscious choices based on our free will. You know, I remember those episodes when I had cravings that were so intense that they were like that unbearably uncomfortable proverbial itch that I just had to scratch. It's almost a physical type of discomfort. You know, you like, you're fit to be tied. And so, of course, at some point you break and you give in to that overwhelming temptation and that urge and have the food that you know is bad for you. And of course, afterwards, when you've come back to your senses, you think to yourself, geez, that was bad. I mean, I could have totally managed to regulate the intensity of that craving by tapping. If only I had remembered to do that. Okay? But somehow, tapping didn't occur to me when I was in the middle of my episode, as if I had never even heard of it or known that it was an option. It's almost like you get amnesia when you're consumed by that insatiable urge that becomes your singular focus. The only thing I can compare it to is a type of trance, really. And you see, this is the first hurdle you have to overcome when trying to correct a pathological behavior. But if that wasn't hard enough, we're also at the mercy of our hormones and neurotransmitters, which influence our actions and reactions. This is something that women are especially familiar with due to the hormonal fluctuations of their monthly cycle. PMS brings on the mood swings and the cravings. And if you've had PMS, then you also know how difficult it is to override these emotional fluctuations and impulses just by urging your will. And if you're a man and you know somebody who has PMS, then you also know this quite intimately. You know, it's like you become a different person. I remember having an experience when I was aware of saying something that was really not nice and offensive to a boyfriend. And I was actually horrified by the words that were coming out of my mouth. Yet at the same time, I couldn't seem to stop myself. It was like I was observing someone else who was using my body and controlling it as if I were possessed. So it's kind of a surreal type of feeling and experience. So similarly, this is what happens in cases of addiction. In order to circumvent our unhealthy yet deeply ingrained impulses, the conscious mind would not only have to override the primitive reptilian brain with its firmly established coping mechanisms, but we also have to contend with the effects of specific hormones and neurotransmitters as well. Now, of course, if you are an exceptional human being, maybe like Wim Hof, who is the Iceman, then maybe your unshakable will and determination could counteract your brain's automatic conditioning. However, no strength of character is capable of overriding biochemical signaling. We simply don't have the ability to regulate chemistry through intention or will, period. You probably heard of truth serum, which is a drug, something like sodium amytal or sodium pentothal, used in interrogations during World War II to extract truthful statements from captured enemy combatants. And once this drug is administered, even if you wanted to lie and conceal information, you're not able to, because the drug inhibits your ability to do so. It simply overrides your intention and therefore free will. Now, since most of us never had an experience with truth serum, I think a more relatable example of this would be alcohol intoxication. Think about what happens when a person gets drunk and how their behavior is affected. When blood alcohol levels are really high and a person is drunk, they're going to lose control of their body to some extent. Usually it's the coordination and balance. They'll also have slurred speech, slow reflexes, and impaired thinking. And on top of that, alcohol also lowers inhibitions and amplifies emotions, causing us to act out inappropriately. Aside from health considerations, another reason I don't drink alcohol is that I never liked how it made me feel, and specifically that feeling of being out of control. So the point is that when you have a chemical imbalance that alters your behavior, causing you to act out compulsively, you're not going to be able to override it despite your best intentions. Same way, you can't make someone stop being drunk just because you said so. And the same way, you can't make someone stop being bipolar or schizophrenic by having them talk about their feelings or do meditation. And so it's the same with binge eating. This pathological behavior is brought about by a type of neurotransmitter intoxication, if you will. So the case I'm making here is that if your chemistry is out of whack and your neurotransmitters are out of balance, therapy or behavior modification alone aren't going to be sufficient in breaking you out of the vicious cycle of food addiction. Now, of course, your psychiatrist could put you on psychoactive medication. But if you're in this group, then my guess is that it's not something you're going to be interested in. This means that in order to effectively deal with our addictive impulses, we have to address the underlying chemical factors involved in creating destructive patterns of acting out. I will focus our discussion today primarily on dopamine and serotonin, which are directly involved in addiction and compulsion, as well as impulse control. Because understanding how various chemicals alter our emotions can help us alter our biochemistry in such a way as to make it possible to create emotional balance and contentment, and also give us back control. Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers in the brain that send signals to other parts of the body. Serotonin and dopamine are just two of the many types of neurotransmitters. But the reason we're focusing on them specifically is that many mental health issues are related to the imbalances of serotonin and dopamine. Although both dopamine and serotonin relay messages between neurons and affect mood and concentration, they differ in their distinct functions. Having too much or too little of either neurotransmitter can cause psychological and physical symptoms. So first, let's talk about dopamine. Dopamine is connected with the brain's pleasure center and can drive our behavior towards things that bring a spike to that center of the brain. It regulates mood and muscle movement and plays a vital role in the brain's reward system. While dopamine directs vital functions like drinking water and eating food, it can also manifest in less healthy behaviors like binge eating or drug use. Dopamine is often discussed in association with addiction because it can drive behavior towards things that will activate the pleasure centers of the brain, which control motivation, desire, and cravings. Dopamine is secreted in the brain every time we do something that gives us pleasure. The spike of dopamine then motivates us to keep doing the behavior that brought us the rewarding feeling. Eating certain foods, taking illicit drugs, and engaging in behaviors such as gambling or shopping can all cause dopamine levels in the brain to spike. Higher levels of dopamine can lead to feelings of euphoria, bliss, and enhanced motivation and concentration. And that's why exposure to substances and activities that increase dopamine can become addictive. But this is the interesting paradox. What happens is that in response to dopamine surge, the brain weakens or eliminates the receptors that are built to respond to the chemical, making them less sensitive to its presence. This means that the next time we repeat the activity that produced that euphoric dopamine spike, it's much less satisfying or rewarding. And that's why addicts are compelled to keep seeking more of the substance, in our case food, to elicit the same surge of dopamine. So the mechanism in the binge eating cycle is that once we elicit a pleasurable response due to dopamine release, we are then driven to continue eating in order to keep that intoxicating feeling going, which actually decreases progressively the more we eat. And as our pleasure continues to diminish due to weakened receptors, we are driven to eat even more to make up for this reduced high, which of course is a losing battle, because the more we eat, the more we dilute that euphoric sensation, which in turn increases our discontent and therefore the compulsion to get back to that sweet spot. So we're basically living the Rolling Stones song, "I can't get no satisfaction." And that's what dopamine does. Serotonin, on the other hand, is often associated with happiness and good moods. But rather than being a mood booster, serotonin is more of a regulator. By keeping our feelings stable, it acts to prevent any major fluctuations in happiness. In other words, it makes us feel content, satiated, and satisfied. Apart from being intricately involved in core physical processes such as the regulation of sleep, appetite, and aggression, serotonin is also a key player in mood, anxiety, fear, and general sense of well-being. Low serotonin is associated with a sad, depressed mood, low energy, negative thoughts, feeling tense and irritable, cravings, and reduced interest in sex. Other serotonin-related disorders include anxiety, panic attacks, insomnia, PMS, obesity, eating disorders, of course, OCD, and substance abuse. It's a known fact that dopamine and serotonin have opposite effects on appetite. Whereas serotonin suppresses it, dopamine can actually stimulate hunger. Additionally, while dopamine enhances impulsivity, serotonin inhibits it. Serotonin also appears to inhibit dopamine production itself, which means that low levels of serotonin can lead to an overproduction of dopamine. And as we've established, overproduction of dopamine leads to impulsive behavior due to its role in reward-seeking behavior. Let me circle back to the case I mentioned earlier about the woman who can easily drive fast for days, but then goes on a binge as soon as she breaks the fast. Why is this? What I believe happens is that while she's fasting, her dopamine levels are stable, because by abstaining from food altogether, she is not eliciting that pleasurable dopamine release. However, as soon as she starts eating, her dopamine spikes. But because she doesn't have enough serotonin to balance it out, she's unable to regulate her appetite, and so she just keeps on eating. So you see, without adequate levels of serotonin to help offset the compulsive, pleasure-seeking effects of dopamine, we're not likely to succeed in overcoming addictive tendencies and behaviors, at least not in the long term. But it's not all about counteracting and balancing out the dopamine that's already been released as a result of eating pleasure-inducing food. When old trauma or unresolved emotions get triggered, causing us uncomfortable feelings like anxiety, fear, or hopelessness, or inadequacy, without having enough serotonin to help stabilize these unsettling feelings, we are more likely to seek out harmful, addictive substances or behaviors as a way of coping, because we're looking for that feel-good dopamine hit to relieve our discontent and suffering so that we can feel better. You see, what drives us at our core is a very simple but extremely powerful motivation. And this motivation is to move away from that which we perceive as painful or uncomfortable and move toward that which we perceive as pleasurable or rewarding. That's it. This is about as complex as human beings are. Of course, pain is the strongest motivator, and what it motivates us to do is to get out of it as quickly as possible. And of course, we will always choose the shortest and easiest way to accomplish that goal, be it through food, drugs, sex, gambling, or whatever. Not surprisingly, most of us choose food because it's legal, inexpensive, it's easily accessible, and it carries no societally judgmental stigma. So my point is that to deal with pathological disordered eating with any degree of long-term success, we must address the underlying biochemical imbalances. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult for us to assert our positive intentions and exercise free will. Getting our neurotransmitters up to normal levels will make it easier to manage our discontent, thus enabling us to make healthier choices. How do we do that? 50% of dopamine and as much as 95% of serotonin is made in our gut. There are approximately 400 to 600 million neurological brain-gut connections, which is why the gut is often called the second brain. Proper functioning of the system is essential for mental and physical health. We now know that gut bacteria influence neural circuits that are implicated in addiction-related behaviors. These include circuits involved in stress, reward, and motivation, which suggests that significant gut-brain interactions take place in drug addiction. There was a study that examined how alterations of microbiota affect behavioral responses to cocaine in mice. 2 groups of mice were given cocaine. One of them had been administered antibiotics for 10 days prior to being given the drug. The results showed that reduction of intestinal flora via the action of antibiotics caused increased sensitivity to the behavioral effects of cocaine. After the mice with compromised gut flora were given probiotics and the cocaine experiment was repeated, it was found that replenishing beneficial bacteria reversed sensitivity to the behavioral effects of cocaine. Another human study analyzed the intestinal flora of 60 alcoholics who used similar amounts of alcohol. After 19 days in rehab, it became apparent that there was a big difference in how well the participants recovered. Their risk of relapse and sense of well-being was connected to their gut flora. 26 out of the 60 alcoholics were diagnosed with leaky gut syndrome and had a low amount of intestinal bacteria. After 19 days without alcohol, these 26 subjects still scored very high on tests that measured anxiety, depression, and alcohol cravings. In fact, there wasn't much of a difference from before they went to rehab. On the other hand, the other 34 subjects with normal gut flora were recovering much more quickly and scored low on anxiety, depression, and alcohol cravings. Not only that, but their scores decreased to the levels that were similar to that of the control group who didn't have a drinking problem. And this shows us that intestinal flora is connected to the likelihood of relapse after sobering up. When it comes to food and eating habits, studies have also shown a correlation between obesity and antibiotic use. Because obviously antibiotics destroy our microbiota. It's been found that obese people lack certain bacteria strains that keep appetite in check, which of course makes them feel hungrier, causing them to overeat. And this is why I say that therapy and behavior modification alone won't work for individuals who have chemical neurotransmitter imbalances as a result of gut dysbiosis. That's why, aside from working on our emotions, we must also address our gut health and specifically the intestinal flora. Because when our gut is healthy, the communication between the gut and the brain works properly. This means that enough serotonin is produced and vital essential nutrients are being synthesized, making us feel energized, calm, and giving us an overall sense of well-being as a result. Now, since we have established that adequate serotonin levels are the key to regulating mood and behavior, and that bacteria are responsible for correct serotonin messaging between the gut and the brain, let's take a closer look at how this relationship operates. Serotonin, also known as 5-hydroxytryptamine or 5-HT for short, is made and stored in the enterochromaffin cells of the gut, which are neuroendocrine cells found in the gastric glands of the gastric mucosa. Certain microbes impact the development and function of these cells. Lab experiments have also shown that some species of bacteria grown in culture can produce 5-HT themselves, which suggests that indigenous members of the microbiota may actually contribute to host serotonin levels directly. On the other hand, an overabundance of bad bacteria creates toxic byproducts called lipopolysaccharides, which have been linked to low serotonin levels, leading to anxiety, depression, and compulsive tendencies. Unfortunately, a great deal of people suffer from gut dysbiosis, which for many begins in the womb because we inherit our bacterial profile from the mother. So if mom's gut was imbalanced, the baby's will be as well. But in addition to heredity, how a baby is born has a profound effect on their microbiome as well. Studies have found that children born through the vaginal canal carry different microbes from those that are delivered via cesarean section. Newborns delivered by C-section tend to lack strains of gut bacteria found in healthy children and adults. Instead, their guts harbor harmful microbes that are common in hospitals. Cesarean birth results in a gut microbiome that is much less similar to that of the mother as compared with vaginal birth, and is more likely to include skin and oral microbes and bacteria from the operating room. This situation is made worse by the use of antibiotics that are administered to the mother before the C-section, and which then enter the baby's blood supply through placenta. And on top of that, many pregnant women are given antibiotics during pregnancy, just because, as a prophylactic. So of course, this alters not only their flora, but the flora of the baby as well. Now, normally, babies can also get bacteria during breastfeeding. But if mom has antibiotics in her system that already negatively impact her bacterial load, antibiotics then also get transferred to the child through milk. Another interesting component to this is that C-section babies are 50% less likely to breastfeed because they're not able to bond and latch, which further decreases their chances to replenish protective bacteria that they missed out on during birth. Now, normally, I don't recommend probiotics because most commercially sold products contain random strains, including milk and kefir cultures. And the issue with that is that if you are a vegan, which means that you don't consume dairy, you're now populating your gut with bacteria that are going to crave dairy because that is their food source. And if they crave dairy, that means you crave dairy. And I don't think that that's what you want. That being said, I am for using specific cultures that target specific imbalances. Certain culture strains have been identified as necessary for mood regulation and general sense of well-being. The list that I found is really long, so I have narrowed it down to the species that you can actually find commercially and buy. These are mainly lactobacillus class of bacteria that convert sugar to lactic acid. These are L. brevis, L. plantarum, L. acidophilus, L. helveticus, L. rhamnosus, and L. gasseri. The rhamnosus and gasseri strains in particular have been linked to appetite and craving control. Then some bifidum cultures like B. infantis, lactis, longum, and brevis have also shown to be important in mood regulation. I like this particular brand called Lifted Naturals. I hope you can see it. It has 2 probiotic formulas that contained the cultures I mentioned, without any fillers or preservatives. This one is called Mood Boosting Probiotic, and they have another version, I believe is called Mood Super Strains. I prefer this one because it has a greater variety of strains. But neither of the 2 versions contain L. gasseri. So if I were you, I would just buy that separately as a standalone. I have it right here. It's by Swanson, which is not really the best, but in a pinch, it will do. And both of these you can buy on Amazon. If you're a student of Dr. Morse's, then you know that the use of probiotics is generally frowned upon. It's sort of a big no-no. The line of thinking is that our gut flora depends on our food choices, which means that if our diet is good and healthy, the gut should get populated by the right bacteria. And in principle, this is true. However, it's becoming increasingly difficult to maintain the right intestinal flora through diet alone. One of the reasons is that we don't get enough soil-based bacteria because extensive farming has depleted the soil. And even organic produce gets treated with pesticides. And so the choice we often face is, do we keep the bacteria but ingest harmful chemicals, or do we get rid of the pesticides by washing the produce with soap, but lose the beneficial bacteria as a result? And then add to that, not getting a good bacterial profile from the mother, either because mom herself wasn't healthy enough or because you were born via C-section, plus pathologically excessive use of antibiotics and other pharmaceuticals, combined with decades of crappy diet. And what you get is gut flora that's been decimated and overrun by pathogenic microorganisms. So in cases of addictive tendencies that are extremely difficult to control, I would suggest that you get a good probiotic blend, like the one I mentioned. Because if you can't eat right due to uncontrollable urges, then you don't stand a chance of correcting your gut flora. It sort of becomes a catch-22. You can't temper your binge eating, in part because you lack good bacteria. And you can't populate your gut with good bacteria because it requires that you eat right, which you can't do due to your eating disorder. See the problem? So instead of being high and mighty purists, we need to be pragmatic and use whatever tools we have available to us to help us get on the path to recovery. Now, while our gut health and bacterial diversity create the right environment and foundation for serotonin production, they're only a part of the whole picture. We still need the right raw materials to make it. 5-HT, meaning serotonin, is synthesized from tryptophan, which is an essential amino acid. Essential means that our body can't make it, and the only way we can get it is by consuming foods that contain it. The mechanism of 5-HT synthesis is as follows. Tryptophan gets into the neurons via bloodstream. And once inside the nerve cell, it's then synthesized into serotonin. But to get into the brain cells, tryptophan requires some transport system to carry it across the blood-brain barrier. And this is where it gets tricky. There are 3 different types of amino acids. Cationic means positively charged, anionic means negatively charged, and neutral. And each of these groups uses a different charge-specific amino acid transporter. Being a neutral amino acid, tryptophan competes for this transport system with other aminos in its class, such as leucine, valine, histidine, methionine, threonine. There are some others, but the most important one is tyrosine. Now, tyrosine is important because it's used to synthesize dopamine. You can think of this as a bunch of people getting on a train during rush hour. The train is only so big and it can only transport a certain number of passengers. And there are always significantly more people trying to get a spot on the train than the train can accommodate. This means that if you want to make it to work on time, you'll have to push your way through the crowd in order to get past a bunch of other commuters. And to do this, you need to be faster, bigger, and more assertive than your competition. And when the train leaves the station, there's a bunch of people left on the platform who didn't make it, which means that they're not going to get to work, and therefore their important job isn't going to get done. The highest concentrations of tryptophan are found in meat and fish, which as vegans, we don't eat. Other foods that contain good amount of tryptophan are nuts, seeds, and chocolate. And that's why we crave chocolate as comfort food during the times of emotional ups and downs, because subconsciously we're trying to raise our serotonin levels. Fruits and vegetables contain tryptophan as well, but much, much less of it. So when we eat food which contains a number of amino acids in different ratios, it's not only about the amount of each amino acid that's important, but what ratio it's in relative to other aminos in that specific transport group. This means that when you have tyrosine competing with tryptophan, tyrosine is going to elbow its way through the crowd and make it to work where it's going to be synthesizing dopamine, while tryptophan is going to be left on the platform, battered and bruised. And because tryptophan didn't get on the train, now there's nobody at the factory making serotonin. So you see the issue here. You will find that tryptophan concentration and ratio in foods is very low and often the lowest compared to all the other aminos in its class. And it's even lower in fruits than in vegetables. A banana is the only fruit known to contain both tryptophan and vitamin B6, both of which are needed to produce serotonin. In fact, there are a bunch of cofactors involved that are necessary for successful 5-HT synthesis. These are vitamins D, C, magnesium, zinc, iron, and vitamins B3 and B6. So you need to make sure that you're not deficient in any of these, and especially vitamin D, zinc, and iron. Now, I'd like to emphasize that most deficiencies are a result of poor digestion, absorption, and utilization. Vitamin D would be an exception in this respect because it's made in the body from sun exposure. I've recently had an important realization, which is that a disproportionately large number of raw vegans and fruitarians are deficient in vitamin D because this hormone is stored in fat tissue. So when we switch to a raw diet, and more so if we also fast on a regular basis, we lose our fat reserves, and with them, our vitamin D stores. Most people who consume conventional diet get their vitamin D from animal products, which we no longer eat. And if on top of that, you live in a northern climate where you don't get enough sun exposure, you're going to have a really hard time replenishing your reserves of vitamin D. So that's just an additional note for you to keep in mind. But to get back to tryptophan, as you can see, it's not so easy to make adequate amounts of serotonin from food, especially if you consider that only a portion of tryptophan is used for serotonin synthesis, and majority is used for a number of other chemical processes in the body, like making sleep hormone melatonin, for example. It's roughly estimated that only 1% of dietary tryptophan, only 1% is used for serotonin synthesis in the brain. So it's like having one employee doing multiple jobs with not enough time or resources. And this is why we need herbs. Wild yam, hops flowers, burdock root, Garcinia cambogia, oat straw, St. John wort, rhodiola, angelica root, bacopa, dandelion root, and ginseng are just some of the many serotonin boosting herbs that you can try. St. John's wort and rhodiola in particular help slow the breakdown of serotonin, because sometimes it's not about how much you make. Sometimes the issue is that you're burning through it too quickly. So these two herbs act as SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. I would also recommend that you take a combination or a few of these herbs and not just one. I would say at least 3 or 4 at a time, because herbs always work better in synergy with other like-minded herbs. And there's something else that's very important. These herbs should always be taken on an empty stomach and away from food. Otherwise, the tryptophan in herbs is going to have to compete with the amino acids in food. And you already know how that's going to go, right? So what I can tell you is that if your problems are related to serotonin, this combination of probiotics and herbs is very, very effective. I know it works because I've been doing it. But keep in mind that when you go on this protocol, it may take a few weeks to see significant changes, because herbs don't work in the same way as pharmaceuticals, where you take a pill and within an hour you get the effect. So be patient and consistent. Don't skip doses, don't skip days. Also take into account that serotonin synthesis and its availability in your system can be affected by a variety of factors. For instance, prolonged periods of stress can deplete serotonin levels. Genetic factors, faulty metabolism, and digestive issues can, of course, impair absorption and breakdown of our food, which reduces our ability to build serotonin. Toxic substances like heavy metals, pesticides, drugs, and some prescription medications can cause permanent damage to the nerve cells that make serotonin. And then, of course, caffeine, alcohol, nicotine, artificial sweeteners, antidepressants, and some cholesterol-lowering medications deplete serotonin. And hormonal changes, as combined with a lack of sunlight, will also contribute to low serotonin levels. Now, the last thing I want to mention is Serotonin Syndrome, which is when you have too much serotonin in your system. This usually happens when you either combine several different psych meds together, like SSRIs, or when you combine these medications with synthetic tryptophan supplements, or even herbs. So you have to be aware of this, especially when you are on medication, because serotonin syndrome can be fatal. Symptoms of this syndrome include twitching and loss of muscle control, confusion, agitation and restlessness, You will see dilated pupils. You may have nausea, headache, vomiting, rapid heart rate, even tremors. There may also be changes in heart rate and temperature. So these are the things you need to look out for and take great care so that you don't get yourself in trouble. And of course, it goes without saying that this mechanism of serotonin dopamine interaction doesn't just apply to eating. This, of course, applies to all addictions. We're simply focusing on binge eating and disordered eating in this particular webinar, but you can apply this to a cross section of disorders. This even applies to ADHD, where they have found that depletion of tryptophan exacerbated ADHD in people. All right, so I hope I presented my case with clarity, and if you have any questions, I'm here to answer them for you.
Okay, Ivana, thank you very, very much. It was amazing, very informative. I liked that you actually mixed in practical examples from life. Maybe you could summarize, because it was lots of information. Maybe you could just summarize the main points that are important for people to know, for people who do encounter this problem of addiction. Just few words about serotonin, about dopamine. Like basic definitions. Just short summary of what you have just said, please.
So, addictive tendencies are caused by overproduction of dopamine and our inability to regulate it. What regulates dopamine is serotonin. When we don't make enough serotonin, this is where we get in trouble, where we lose the ability to regulate our emotions. We also, another interesting thing is serotonin, apart from the mood and our sense of well-being, regulates sleep. So you're going to have insomnia. Okay, it regulates gut motility. You're going to be constipated, which is why they're finding a correlation between depression and chronic constipation, right? So it's extremely important to understand that you have two major players. You have dopamine and you have serotonin. We need both, but we need to be able to keep dopamine in check. And that's what serotonin does. Another point is very difficult to get enough serotonin made by getting our amino acid tryptophan from food, because tryptophan is a weaker amino acid that has to fight much harder with its cohorts and is used for much more functions in the body. So most of us are deficient, especially if we don't consume animal products, because tryptophan is in much lower concentrations in plants. Okay, so this is why you need herbs. Of course, you cannot synthesize serotonin if you don't have the right conditions for it. And the right conditions mean you have to have proper bacterial balance in your gut. If you are constipated, if you have a lot of waste matter in there, if you have a lot of lymphatic sewage backed up in the gut, it's going to be difficult for you, because this creates unfavorable bacteria, because that waste feeds it. It makes it proliferate. These bacteria create byproducts that themselves lower serotonin. So you have to make sure that you're cleaning your gut. If you suspect that you have poor intestinal flora, then you supplement with probiotics, but choose specific strains. Don't just go and buy a multi-strain probiotic off the shelf that has random strains. Be targeted with it. And what you do, I suggest that you take probiotics for a time. I'm not saying you're going to be on this long term. You take it maybe for a bottle, then you stop and you see how you feel. Okay? And maybe you come back 2-3 months later and you do another course of probiotics. And then once you've populated your gut, then you're good. And this is why I said earlier that it's extremely important to have cleaned out GI tract. Because if your GI tract is full of mess, these new strains of probiotics that you're trying to take in your intestines are simply not going to stay, because you have to create the right environment for them. And then, of course, herbs. Herbs that are specifically indicated for serotonin production. They have concentrated amounts of the raw materials, of the building blocks of this important neurotransmitter. And you take them. And I have to tell you, the difference that I have experienced in myself has been unbelievable. Every day I wake up, I am happy. I wake up with energy. This is a new concept for me. I mean, it used to take me 2 hours to come to my senses after I woken up. And I would always tell people, just because I'm vertical and my eyes are open doesn't mean I'm awake. I'm just walking around, but I'm not really here yet. I need time to sort of wake my brain up. I don't have these issues anymore. I'll find myself walking down the street and I'm smiling, and I'll catch myself and I go, what are you smiling about? What are you happy about? Nothing. I just am. And it's really amazing what it does for your mood. The most beautiful thing I noticed when it comes to food is that it used to be that I would eat, and I would eat a big enough amount for me to feel full, yet I wouldn't feel full. I would start to think what else I want to do. You know, what else I want to eat, put in my body. And the transition happened gradually, where it went from, I finished my meal, I have still the sensation I want to eat. But 10 minutes later, it completely goes away. And then it progresses where that time frame of feeling full after a meal contracts and shortens. And then you just eat and you feel full. And you can walk by the foods that used to really trigger you, and you just feel indifferent. And this is a very sort of refreshing feeling when you have a sense of control. So this is not to say that taking probiotics and these herbs are going to fix your problems. These are aids. You still have to work on your emotions, absolutely. But what raising your serotonin does, it creates a buffer. It gives you space to breathe, where you can step back instead of being crazed and completely taken over by the craving. You can say, calm down, and then you can make a decision. You can say no in that moment. You don't act impulsively. You can actually control the impulse. Does that cover it for you?
Yeah, it covered very, very well. Now, as I understood from your speech, the serotonin is the problematic factor, because sometimes it's lacking. But can the problem be in the dopamine and not in serotonin? Can body work normally in terms of serotonin production, but dopamine be a problematic factor in this binge eating and food addiction?
Not in binge eating, in anorexia. Anorexia is a little different. Now, we still have abnormally low serotonin levels, but in anorexia, the dopamine signaling pathway is dysregulated. So in a normal brain, when serotonin is released, it makes us feel good. It gives us a sensation of pleasure, euphoria. But in the brain of an anorexic person, when dopamine is released, it creates intense anxiety. And of course, because you don't have adequate serotonin, then you cannot regulate the anxiety. And this is why food and the act of eating becomes associated and brings on feelings of intense anxiety. And this is why a person who is anorexic avoids food, avoids eating. There's a fear of food. So this would be one example of how dopamine would be an issue. So also compulsive behavior. Anorexia is an addiction, and it's also compulsive behavior, but it manifests differently. We're still dealing with an interplay of dopamine and serotonin, but it's slightly altered.
Yeah, very interesting. So I also wanted to ask, what kind of behaviors, maybe habits, or what kind of practices, other than taking in physical substances, can increase and help production of serotonin?
Well, exercise is said to be one of them. Exercise, doing pleasurable activities, rest, meditation, also are known to do this, but they're not as effective. You understand? It's like saying, if you meditate, you're going to make this flower grow. No, you have to add water. You have to have soil for that flower. There are certain limitations in terms of activities. Keeping your stress levels low, of course, is going to preserve your serotonin. So, because stress is obviously causing us to lose serotonin. But as far as activities other than exercise and keeping our stress levels low, I can't name any other. Not that they don't exist, I'm just not aware.
And do you know how actually stress affects serotonin? Like you said that it burns serotonin, but in which, like how fast? For example, 1 minute of stress or 5 minutes of stress, how much serotonin does it burn? Do you know in terms of quantities?
I can't narrow it down to specific duration of stress, but the mechanism of it is that it burns through it too quickly. So you use it up too quickly, use it up faster than you can make it. This is how it depletes serotonin.
Okay. And my last question is, would you recommend the same procedure and the same ingredients in order to treat any kind of addiction, such as addiction to computer games, to pornography, to whatever? So it should be the same tools of taking probiotics, herbs,
Yes.
etc.
Yes, because I cited studies with alcoholics, with cocaine. There was also another study that I read about that was done in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, where they were trying to deal with their addiction to devices. And they would call it dopamine starvation, where they're trying to reduce dopamine production by avoiding the activities that cause the release of dopamine and the association of that pleasurable sensation that they get from interacting with their devices, computers, games, and so on. Yes. So it would work in all cases, because even aggression, this is so interesting. There's the difference between an alcoholic that's going to be violent and non-violent is the amount of serotonin they each have, because serotonin also regulates aggression. So people who are violent, there's an overproduction of dopamine and very little serotonin, and that's why they can't control their urge. So I would say yes, even in anorexia, which has a different dopamine regulatory mechanism that's altered, the issue is still that that person cannot regulate the anxiety. And having serotonin is going to at least bring it down to manageable levels, so they can maybe then implement the therapeutic approach, the techniques that the therapist would give this person.
Good. So if I understand you right, then, for example, if a client comes to you now and he has any kind of addiction, let's say he's addicted to computer games, so, or to whatever, or to anything else. So you would tell him, on one hand, you might tell him to reduce the amount of time he spends in gaming and computer games, but on the other hand, just give him this protocol of taking probiotics and herbs, and then the production of serotonin will help balance out this sense of emptiness and dopamine starvation that he will get from abandoning those computer games.
Not just that. The thing is, the idea is that taking the herbs and probiotics is going to raise your serotonin levels so you can actually abandon the gaming. You understand the compulsion? The definition of compulsion is something you can't stop doing. It just, you're compelled to do it, not stop.
Right.
And this is the problem, because you don't have the control of that. You feel completely out of control. Mm-hmm. You want to stop, but you just can't seem to stop.
Yes.
So getting your serotonin levels up enables you to then stop. It's almost like slowing down the film, making it go in slow motion, where you can now see what is causing you to act out. So you can more effectively now work on that. So if a client came to me, I still want them to be in therapy. I still want them to talk about the things that trigger them. I still want them to release the feelings that are causing the anxiety.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So it would be a combination of things.
I understand. Okay, thank you very much. Let's see if any other people have any more questions. If not, then we will just finish our webinar. Okay, so anyway, I think we're going to finish for now. I'm going to post it on YouTube, and if people have any more questions for you, they can just post it on our group, and and then you can just relate to that.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ivana. It was really, really life-saving, I think, for many, many people, and very informative. And thank you for all this wealth of knowledge that you shared with us.
You're most welcome. I'll see you soon.
See you soon. Bye-bye.